Slavery, it's not a new thing. In fact, it's been going on for pretty much as long as we can read back into in regards to the histories of ancient peoples. I don't really know necessarily what spurred my interest to research into this, but I decided I'd do a little presentation on it, so I hope everybody enjoys the articles presented and the things discussed. Enjoy the video. So we begin by looking at the time of 297 293 BC from the Third Samnite War. And figures from Livy indicate that over 66,000 captives were enslaved from a variety of defeated enemies. And just to note, this isn't necessarily, some foreign peoples that were enslaved by these peoples. They were people pretty much of their own country. It would be like, traveling to another state and taking slaves from another state that you had just conquered, pretty much. These were, kind of relative to their land, were actually not that foreign. So, whites taking on whites as slaves. And this article goes on to discuss how the Roman Empire ended up occupying what is now Britain and having, white slaves do labor for them in the mines. Here's another figure citing that, even later, you have estimates of 2 million slaves for a total population of 6 million people with actual slaves. So that's quite a huge difference. And so, the reasons why people take slaves is pretty obvious. I mean, if you're the upper echelons of society in your class, then you obviously, want more time to do the things that you desire rather than having to do petty work, physical labor, and you can enjoy doing things that, are more benefiting towards your wills and desires in life. Here's another article talking about slavery in Africa before European arrival. And so, not only was slavery an established institution of West Africa before European traders arrived, but Africans were also involved in a trans-Saharan trade in slaves along these routes. So slavery has been going on for a long time. It's not necessarily race-oriented, more so just conquered entities and, foreign powers being enslaved for means of physical labor and other things. I mean, a lot of the issues become later on that people that were once slaves that become emancipated are in a foreign land and they're outnumbered by the natives to this land that they've been brought to, and now they really, don't have any form of identity with the people that have been there for, so long. This paper right here actually describes it. It's kind of an interesting paper. It talks about how slave owners are actually, in essence, they have to be very, kind and, well-meaning toward the slaves that they had. This discussion is not necessarily to point out that slavery is a good thing, but, it just goes on to say, in a slave economy, however, both the amount of labor to be extracted from a slave and his consumption or feeding are determined by the slave owner. The amount of work they do is in direct relation to their health. So a healthier slave is going to be able to do more work. So it's in their best interest to keep their workers healthy. And then in this book, we examine the topic where emancipation was actually detrimental towards slaves due to the fact that, as soon as you're emancipated, you're going into a totally different society. The people that were the slave owners, they have to do a lot of political work and things to that extent, not only with other families and other businesses, but with government and other entities as well. And so if you've been a slave your whole life and, for generations, then what's happening is you're all of a sudden in this new world. You have no connections, no family connections or anything to that extent. and you're a fish out of water. And so actually this one is saying that slavery was actually emancipation is actually a bad thing for slaves, um, which is interesting. So slavery takes on many forms, and you can see here that you can use mechanical advantage through weapons of war, such as like a sword, or I can use something more advanced like a gun. Um, you know, but then as soon as those things become, those are very visible forms of slavery, using sheer force to enslave somebody. Whereas today, another form of slavery really represents itself, and this comes in the form of economic slavery, where it's not necessarily somebody pointing a gun at you, but the gun is indirect. And you can see here that, you know, there really is another form of slavery which has presented itself today. And it's not necessarily at gunpoint or at sword point or, through means of physical enslavement, as it has kind of been throughout historical records. It's more so of enslavement through, you know, vast amounts of documents which are not easily understood and require many different pathways to go through, and require you to, enlist help from organizations and other peoples to, you know, accomplish what it is that you're being asked to do and everything to that extent. Um, you can see here that the differences in, upper, middle, and working class and lower class. It's the lower class actually follows a really highly correlated line in correspondence with the upper class, and the working and middle class follows a pretty steady, 50 to 45%, and this is between 1980 and 2012. Um, the story of slavery always reminds me of the myth of Prometheus. And you might say, well, why does it remind you of the myth of Prometheus? Well, if you remember the story correctly, Prometheus is the one who went to Zeus and begged him to give fire to the people so that they might have a little comfort through the long and dreary months of the winter. And Zeus says to Prometheus, I will not. Not one spark will I share with them. For if men had fire, they might become strong and wise like us. And after a while, they would drive us out of our kingdom. Besides, fire is a dangerous tool, and they are too poor and ignorant to be trusted with it. So this is a story within a story within a story. The fire in itself represents knowledge. And if you have knowledge, then you are no longer, being held captive in this sense. But at the same point in time, what Zeus is saying is that, emancipation, like this document here, is actually very difficult for a people to accomplish, because as soon as you're emancipated, you now find yourself in an unknown world where you're dealing with factors and policies that you weren't necessarily equipped with or grew up knowing how to deal with. And so this story really has a lot of parallels and metaphors to not only this story but the previous story where Zeus partook in the overthrowing of the Titans before them, and it's also in parable and in metaphorical fashion to the rising generations and the upcoming generation overthrowing the previous generation. So there's a lot of metaphor within this one story alone, which is why I really actually enjoy it quite a bit. Well, there's my little presentation on slavery and emancipation, and how it all relates to Prometheus and giving fire to ancient man, or to the slaves, which is merely knowledge. And if you're no longer the one at the end of the sword, but the one holding the sword, then you can no longer be taken hostage and utilized as a slave. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you all enjoyed the video and learned a little bit about slavery.